In this lesson, let's learn about Active Directory objects. First of all, we will talk about types of AD objects. Then we will see how an AD object is created. And then we will look into the objects identifiers, then the distinguished name, and then the relative distinguished name. And finally, we will sum up the lesson with the keynotes. Everything within an Active Directory forest is considered an object. There are two types of objects in Active Directory. The first type is container object. Container objects can store other objects, for example, domains, organizational units, or groups are container objects. The second type is leaf object. Leaf objects cannot store other objects, for example, users or computers. So it-lifeskill.local domain is a container object, and the training group in the domain it-lifeskill.local is also a container object. The computer and the users in the group are the leaf objects. Let's see how an Active Directory object is created. As you may know, Active Directory schema defines classes for all of its objects. Each object class contains a set of attributes to describe the object. And Active Directory uses the class to instantiate new objects of that class. For example, in the Active Directory schema for the forests that contain the it-lifeskills.local, we have the user class, which contains the set of attributes over here to describe the user object. Now, when we create a new user in the it-lifeskills.local, it will check with Active Directory schema to get the user class, and from there it will instantiate new user object and allows us to create user A and user B with the same set of attributes defined in the user class of the Active Directory schema. When a new attribute is created in an AD schema, it will exist in the AD schema forever. When the attribute is added to a class, it will be replicated and populated in all the objects of that class in the entire forest. For example, when we create a new hobby attribute and associated it with the user class, the hobby attribute will be replicated and populated in all the user objects in the entire forest. When an attribute of a class is disable, Active Directory will not remove the attribute from the objects of that class. Therefore, it is not recommended to disable an attribute of a class since it causes the inconsistencies and many applications may still use the attributes. For example, if we disable the hobby attribute in the user class, the hobby attribute still exists in user A, which is created before we disable the attribute. However, when we create a new user object, user B now does not have the hobby attribute, which causing the inconsistency between user A and user B. Moreover, this application uses the hobby attribute to control the access. Now, this application cannot control the access for user B because user B does not have the hobby attribute. Let's talk about object identifiers. Each AD object has one or two unique values. For example, user object is assigned with two identifiers, good or global unique identifier saved in object good attribute, SID or security identifier saved in SID attribute. Let's talk about object GUID. Object GUID is 128-bit value attribute assigned to every object in Active Directory. Object GUID attribute is published to global catalog servers, which means it is frequently used to search or identify objects. When an object is moved from one domain to another domain, the object GUID remains the same. For example, this user is in itlifeskills.local domain. When it moves to ncsas.itlifeskills.local domain, its object GUID remains the same. Now let's talk about security identifier or SID. The SID value of an object is unique within its domain. When an object is migrated to another domain, a new SID is generated and assigned to the object. The old SID value is saved in the SID history attribute of the object. So in this example, the user object is in itlifeskills.local. When it is migrated to ncsa.itlifeskills.local domain, a new SID is generated and assigned to the object, and the old SID is saved in the SID history of the object. Let's analyze a practical example with security identifier. In this example, this user has been granted the full access to the scripts folder, and behind the scene, the access list of the operating system uses the SID of the user to grant the access. So it uses the SID instead of the name. After the user is moved to another domain, it gets a new SID. Now, when the user is trying to access, the access list finds the SID different. The access list then checks the SID history and finds it match. The access is granted. That is the reason why it is not required to re-grant the access to the folder if the account is migrated properly with the right tool, such as ADMT, because ADMT will save the old SID to the SID history attribute of the user account. To move or identify the location of an object, we need to use its distinguished name or DN, which is constructed by three components of ID naming attributes. The first component is domain component or DC. This represents the ID domain name. The second component is containers or CN or organizational unit or OU. This is the path that leads to where the object resides. And the last component is common name or CN. This represents the actual object name, and it is also called relative distinguished name or RDN. Now let's take a look at this example. This is a distinguished name of the administrator user, and here is the domain component, and here is the container name. So the administrator user stay in the user's container, and here is the common name, and it is the name of the user. In this case, is the administrator. Now let's take a look at another example. This is the distinguished name of this user, and here is the domain component, and here is the OU component. From the OU component, we can figure out the path that the user resides is in Office's OUs, and underneath the Office's OU, it has the Austin OUs, and underneath the Austin OU, it has a user's OU, and here is the common name, which is the name of the user. This is the end of this lesson. Please read the keynotes.